The UK and Lagarde was already very, very clear that they were not interested in even discussing rate cuts until they really got some different CPI prints. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the edition of Crashes and Taxes. We are going to through some great information today. I'm not going to do slides. I'm in New York, and I wanted to do Crashes and Taxes and give you guys a great idea of what's happening, but not with slides because it's not going to work in New York. So the first thing I want to talk about is just high level where the market is and what's happening. We just got the ECB, the European Central Bank, saying that they are not looking at lowering rates until June. They will get their first CPI print. UK will get their CPI print in April. And we expected that they wouldn't cut rates at all or have any involvement with rates until they got that first CPI read, which really made it skeptical that the Fed and the US would cut rates in March, considering that the UK and Europe usually goes first on these policies because of the dollar hegemonic status of the US dollar world reserve. And so this ECB coming out, and they were already very clear, the UK and Lagarde was already very, very clear that they were not interested in even discussing rate cuts until they really got some different CPI prints, or inflation prints, we call it CPI here in the United States. So the ECB coming out and saying no cuts until June is going to put more pressure on the Federal Reserve. Now, what has happened in the US side? And I just want to quickly go back to Europe. And I just want to say Germany now is 2 years in a deep, almost manufacturing depression, which is going to further worsen Europe. So it's not that I don't think that Europe will end up cutting. I do think they will end up cutting. I just think that the market expectations of 6 cuts in 2024 is not likely to come to fruition, as the Fed has only said 3, and obviously they're having this difficulty with Europe. Now, I want to talk about Demoterin. Demoterin was my NYU Trium LSE Enchanté. So in other words, he teaches a global MBA program, equity evaluations, very, very well-known, internationally known valuation expert in equities. And he is coming out today on CNBC stating that the S&P 500 is overvalued. And this is the key component that I want you to hear, that you have an internationally recognized equity expert, my personal professor at NYU, who is saying the S&P is overvalued. And he is absolutely correct. We have had nothing but the market push up since 2008, since we really implemented what we call MMT, modern monetary theory. And there is always a push down when you have artificial reasons that the equity markets have pushed up. So since the market is been artificially pushed up since 2008, through Fed stimulus, now that we've gone through not only the Great Recession of 2008 or the global financial crisis, the GFC, as the international world calls it, and coronavirus pandemic of 2020, we have a Fed balance sheet that is so disproportionately too high that they are almost handicapping, not almost, they are handicapping their ability to help in the next major correction. Obviously, you guys know that we're very forward looking at international intricacies of what's happening. And I will just say that we are seeing 2024, unfortunately, as another pandemic year. Specifically, we are looking at what's something called Disease X. Disease X is unfortunately in lab mice has a 100% mortality rate. And so what we started to see is there is going to be, unfortunately, as we're being led with information, there is likely to be another pandemic in 2024. And it is it is expected to be a worse situation, if you can imagine, than coronavirus, almost like a coronavirus was sort of a test case. So that in and of itself is going to be a whole nother macroeconomic global issue for supply chains and businesses staying open. We now have the Biden administration officially reclassifying the Houthis in the Middle East that are basically shooting at American boats, renamed as terrorists. The Trump administration named them as terrorists. The Biden administration taken that um, that label off, and now they're redesignating them that so that they can get military action involved in the Red Sea. So we see already with the geopolitical conflict that both the Red Sea and the Black Sea have massive shipping disruptions. Obviously, the Black Sea is doing much better since it's been going on for literally it'll be 2 years this March that Russia went ahead and or was it 1 year, entered Ukraine. So that being said, I think it's 2 years. That being said, what we're seeing now, if we look now from the macro level, Germany, China's real estate issue, and all of the global geopolitical conflicts, and we come back down to, and potentially another pandemic year with this disease X that's percolating into our sources. Um, what we're starting to see at the micro level is the market starting to realize, oh, maybe it's not what we said. I was just watching another analyst on basically saying that we started 2023 off expecting the worst, expecting recession, preparing for the worst, and really actually ended up getting a different year. We're starting 2024 on the opposite end, which is expecting a soft landing, a recovery, growth, everything looking good, and we're starting to see a pullback, and that's not going to be real. You guys know, if you've watched Crashes and Taxes for any amount of time, that I have been saying since day one, there will be no soft landing. I mean, I am telling you with the most confidence I've ever had. I'm clearly not God. I'm a human. I'm fallible. I could be wrong. But I am telling you with the most confidence I've ever had, there is no soft landing. 2024 is going to be very difficult to navigate economically and certainly from a growth perspective. If you look at the Mag 7 that ended the year, that really made 2023 from an equity perspective in the last 3 months from October through December, when you look at those are all down today. All 7 are down. Apple's had tons of problems. Microsoft is having problems. Everything is having, even NVIDIA is down. So we're looking at microeconomically, the market's starting to realize. So the S&P is down a third day in a row in the last 4 sessions. The Russell 2000, which actually had quite a broadening out of the very kind of end of 2023 going into 2024, it now has going into its 5th negative of 6 trading sessions. So we're starting to see that the market, and don't get me wrong, I don't expect this to go straight back down to negative, but we're starting to see that, yeah, this market is realizing that the soft landing is going to be a lot more difficult, and it's going to be a challenge. You also had strong retail numbers come out for December today, and that also puts Powell again at a disadvantage for cutting rates. So it's the kind of scenario that's the opposite of what we've had for the last 3 years, where bad news was good news because bad economic news meant that Powell and the Fed would be more accommodative with Federal Reserve policy and monetary policy. Now it's the opposite. Now we have good retail numbers, a good headline number, even though the December report at 216 was really a miss because 50,000 jobs were federal. When you start to have all these good economic factors, that's actually bad for equities because that means the Fed won't be as accommodative as fast as the market is expecting. This is why when the Fed said 3 rate cuts at the December FOMC meeting and they paused, but they said, yes, here's a dot plot, 3 rate cuts, and the market priced in 6, I said it from the beginning, the market already is ahead of its skis on this situation. So I want to just go now at a much higher global level, and I want to kind of walk through why I believe the Fed is really disempowered of the ability now to fix. If, let's say, we do hypothetically have a disease X that comes forward and it's another global pandemic worse than coronavirus, and we end up having economic shipping disruptions. We certainly will have a massive demand, a crash in demand. And when we have a crash in demand, that in and of itself is recessionary in and itself. So I want to talk, though, about where the United States is with the budget process and the GDP versus government spending. And I just want to end giving you this high level perspective of why we are in such a precarious state. So let's talk about non-defense spending by the federal government. And that includes basically security. If you look at the 1960s, a non-defense spending by the federal government was only 10% of our GDP, gross domestic product. So what we're producing economically net, we were spending 10% of it on all programming that was non-defense. So all spending at the federal government level, non-defense, not military, literally was 10%. Now that did not grow much because all the way from the 1960s where it was 10% into 2001, it only grew from 10% to 14.8%. And that would represent a natural aging of your older generations moving on to Social Security, Medicare would naturally, as the baby boomer generation, not that at that time, but let's say the greatest generation, which was the generation before the baby boomers, those would have naturally been retiring, and we would have naturally been seeing, yes, okay, the GDP percentage is increasing. That again slowly increased, but you can see by 2007 it was up to 15.2%. So now 15.2% of your non-military spending is completely on your other programs at the federal government level. And then in 2019, it went to 17.8%. So we are now, that's 2019, 17.8%. In 20, projected now in 2020, we peaked in 2020 at 27.7%. Not really a fair assessment because that was the year of the actual pandemic. So I think that that is probably not a great assessment. But if we look at present day 2023, we're at 22%, and we're going to stay at 22% over these next 5 years. So in other words, non-defense spending at 22%, it is taking more than twice of the GDP that it did for the last 60 years. In other words, non-defense spending of GDP is up 45% before the Great Recession, 24% from the year before coronavirus. Now, that is putting our government at approximately $2 trillion of deficits a year, meaning that we're going to grow the $34 trillion of federal debt at $2 trillion a year. The other problem that we have is even though the Great Recession in 2008 was too big to fail, the bank toxic assets, and the pandemic of 2020 coronavirus, even those were one-off events, because we switched our monetary theory to modern monetary theory in 2008, the government has never reduced the spending level back down. In other words, and I've been saying this on multiple podcasts with Crashes and Taxes, in other words, we are still spending at pandemic levels, even though we're not in a pandemic. Like I said, on November 1st of 2023, Yellen, who's obviously Secretary of the Treasury, came out and said, we have to fund 1.6 trillion just through the end of the first quarter of 2024. We are spending so much that it's almost like we are trying to collapse our federal government. It's almost like we're intentionally trying to spend. So there is a shutdown coming, and it's not because of the debt limit this time, it's because they cannot agree on a continuing resolution for appropriations to basically spend the money they've authorized with the debt ceiling. I know a lot of people get confused. I don't understand, Rebecca. You said that they took care of that, and they're not going to have these discussions until after the election in 2025, which I believe is unconstitutional. I believe that will also be a legal issue that will come up. But basically, they don't have anything until 2025. That's true on the debt ceiling. but that doesn't mean that Congress still has to pass an actual budget. And so what we have is we have the Democrats and the Republicans coming together now to actually pass an actual budget. However, the budget is a problem. If you look at the total debt at the low interest rates, like in 2020, with low interest rates, the interest expense that we paid on an annual basis was only just under $333 billion in 2020 of interest expense. In 2023, we have more than doubled that. More, almost, it's $730 billion. By 2028, in just 4 years, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, expects our net interest expense on our federal debt to be over $1 trillion a year. The last time we had a balanced budget was between 1998 and 2001. And in those years, our tax receipts were about 19.4% of GDP. So, what I'm trying to explain to you guys is that the CBO last year in 2023, they forecasted tax receipts 11% higher than they actually came in, and they forecasted spending to be lower by 9%. So the CBO thought we'd get 11% more in tax revenue than we got, and thought we would spend about 10% less than we actually spent. So what I'm trying to tell you there is that the government estimates are always wrong, and they are always wrong to the positive light of what makes the government look better. It's just like 10 of the last 11 monthly jobs numbers that have come out have been revised to the downside, but nobody cares. The market absolutely cares about the headline number that comes out, and the market will go red or green depending on the headline number. But a month later, when the revision comes out and cuts 33% of the jobs, and it's a 33% reduction back downwards, the market doesn't even read it. It doesn't have any impact of any kind whatsoever. The last thing I'm going to share with you in this general update of crashes and taxes is a very important Supreme Court case. It's actually being held at the Supreme Court today, Wednesday. It is January 20th. Oh my gosh, what day is it? It's the 17th, January 17th, Wednesday, January 17th. The arguments are being held right now. There's actually a movie about this, about the fishermen that are having to pay about $700 a day for this federally required monitor. And what happened is, it's very complicated legally, so I'm trying to make this as high level as possible so you guys can understand. There was a case in 1984 called the Chevron case, and basically through that case, the birth of the administrative state happened. We call it in the law Chevron deference. What this means is, and this is what this has enabled, is Congress can write a very generic law specifically about, like, for example, clean water, the Clean Water Act, Clean Water and Air Act, for example, just making this up. And they can be very general and say, we want clean water. And they'll say, well, you know, Congress aren't scientists, Congress aren't experts. We don't know how to determine or how to define clean water particle parts per million. So we're going to basically defer that to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, where they, at the executive side, because Congress is legislative, the executive side of our government, they can get the experts in and they can fine tune and they can write what we call rules and regulations to specify or to clarify what Congress means when they write something as generic as maintain clean water. Then the scientists at the EPA on the executive side can actually define what clean water is in a scientific way. So what happened was, in a 1984 case, someone basically said that the law did not state what the rules at the administrative executive level side of the EPA stated, and therefore it was unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court came back in 1984 and ruled something that has become known as Chevron deference. And what this means that when Congress writes a law that is more unspecific, very generic, that they will defer to the administrative agency that is enforcing that law. Remember, the executive branch enforces the legislative branch's laws, and the judicial branch oversees that they're all constitutional and all of those things. So when the executive branch is enforcing it, the judicial branch will defer to the interpretation of the rules and regulations of the executive branch, i.e., the federal government. And what that 84 Chevron deference has allowed is the federal government to really become an administrative nanny state. They can tell us everything about everything. Congress can have no intention whatsoever but pass a very broad, specific law and rely on the administrative agencies to actually promulgate the rules and regulations to implement that generic law. And so what has really done is created a massive nanny state in this country that when you sue before a court, a federal courts typically refer to the Chevron deference decision in 1984 and basically will side with the federal government. And this makes the people of the country afraid of the federal government because they have all this power, and there's not a lot of judicial review of that power when the judicial policy is to defer to the administrative agency, i.e. the federal government. So what has happened in the fishing case is that it was a burden on the fishermen, and the fishermen were able to find a lawyer who wanted to take this all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is hearing this case today. And I hope that we get a decision that actually breaks Chevron and Chevron deference, because it really sets up a scenario where it's the federal government in charge of everything, and we don't even get a voice in front of the court because they automatically implore this Chevron deference doctrine, and it is problematic. And it has made us a nanny state. Like if you want to have, your kid wants to have a lemonade stand in New York City, the regulations and rules, some of the city, not the federal government, I'm the best example, but there's many, many, many examples of the federal government having so much power with no one really reviewing the scope and breadth of that power. So we're really excited about this case being heard today in the Supreme Court, and we do believe that the nanny state, if not completely dissolved, although it would be hard to see how the Supreme Court would go around and circumvent Chevron without completely absolving it as a precedent. So we're going to see what happens there. But anyways, you guys, to end this crashes in taxes, I just want to say that because of the geopolitical risks and because of the other things that we understand to be coming, and they will be out in the news very soon, specifically disease X that I'm talking about. It's going to make, unfortunately, coronavirus look like a trial run for 2024, and we're going to have a lot of disruption in 2024. The markets won't like that. And of course, this will put the Federal Reserve again in even more precarious state as to how to handle a recovery. And unfortunately, this is exactly what I've been warning about. We are not in a position at the Federal Reserve to handle another global pandemic or any kind of massive, even if the U.S. were to get involved in a war against Russia with NATO because of Ukraine, even if something like that, we don't have the ability for the Fed to control the economy with a balance sheet that's nearly $8 trillion still. They have been very unsuccessful about getting their balance sheet tapered down. They did quantitative tightening for 6 months and then literally dumped in 300 plus when we had bank solvency problems. And of course, we have the bank term funding program that expires in just 2.5 months at the end of March, which there's no way that program is going to be able to go away. So we're seeing bank liquidity problems. On the other hand, you're looking at Citigroup has announced layoffs of 10% of their workforce, 20,000 people. So we know we can see a lot of banking issues. Even Goldman Sachs had a revenue beat, but it wasn't in their traditional sectors of investment banking. So there's just a lot going on, and it just all speaks against soft landing, quick recovery, great 2024. I think that we will still have some time where the market can recover and looks like it's swinging to the upside. But these headwinds that are coming in 2024, unfortunately, mean for me that the market is, we're going to have to pick short-term winners because we aren't going to see longer term winners in 2024. I think the market will be overall down at the end of the year. In fact, it's if these things come to fruition as we are seeing them in our news sources, we think 2024 is going to be very, very, very difficult. Probably actually a global transition year, especially with the BRICS bloc and Saudi Arabia and the UAE now officially joining that BRICS bloc. So it's going to be a great year, very interesting, great year to stay in touch, engage with Crashes and Taxes every single week. So next week, you guys have a great day. Hey.